Okay, hello friends, and welcome to a new Chabura two-part series titled Reactions to Kabbalah, which will explore the history of the rabbinic reception of the Zohar in the 13th century. We're very excited to have JJ Kimche with us, and about our speaker. JJ Kimche is a PhD candidate in the field of modern religious philosophy at Harvard University, where he specializes in the intersection between modern European philosophy and post-Enlightenment Jewish thought. His academic essays and translations have been published in both academic and popular venues. JJ received his undergraduate education at Shalem College, Jerusalem, where he double majored in Western philosophy and Jewish thought. Prior to that, he spent 2 years learning in Yeshivat Har Etzion and completed his military service in the 101st Division of the IDF's Paratroopers Brigade. Born into a family of renowned British rabbis and educators, JJ has been intensely involved in Jewish education for the past 12 years. JJ currently serves as the Orthodox educator at MIT Hillel. With that said, it is also JJ's birthday today, so you want to wish him a happy birthday and many more years of health, happiness, and growth. We had the privilege of having JJ with us in the past with his very well-received series on Shadal, and I highly recommend all to check that out on our website. Also, as mentioned, this shoot is a member series. The first installment will be open to all, but the second will be for just our members. So for those who are not yet, make sure to join us and take advantage of all we have to offer. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And it is a privilege and honor to have with us JJ Kimche. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by once again expressing my admiration for the Chabura and for all that it does, and for those who run it and who spend innumerable hours inviting speakers and proliferating excellent classes and knowledge throughout the Jewish world internationally. Is really something special to be part of. I myself am a member. I recommend everyone else to follow suit as well. And it's a pleasure to be here. And of course, yes, thank you for your warm wishes. I can think of no better way to bring in my new annual cycle, my personal annual cycle, than to teach and to spend time with fine people such as yourselves. Okay, so just before I begin, before I give my slides and my lecture, a couple of prefatory notes and remarks, just to prepare you what we're going to do today and my general style of teaching, and how we're going to approach the subject, the very interesting and intricate and in many ways difficult subject that we are going to try and focus on today. So firstly, as you have noticed, I tend to speak very quickly. I apologize for that. That is very simple. There is an enormous amount of material to get through. And also, I'm part of a generation which generally listens to things on YouTube at 1.5 or 2 speed. And therefore, I tend to mimic that. And therefore, I will be speaking relatively quickly and moving quickly through the material, because really today we are trying to do the impossible, which is to encapsulate and talk intelligently about centuries and centuries of intellectual development over about a 45-minute period, which is going to be the length of the lecture. And then, of course, I'll open up for questions and discussions, and I'm happy to talk to anyone for as long as it takes. So the second point that I'd like to make is that I am both by nature and by training an academic, in that I am not a rabbi. You've had many impressive and important rabbis and educators come to the Chabura. I am not one among them. I am a humble historian, and therefore the approach that I take generally is that of the historian, and that of trying to present what we know, what we don't know, what we try to what we can deduce from the evidence, and what we can perhaps guess from the lack thereof, or from what we in fact have. And therefore, we're going to be talking about Jewish mysticism and specifically Kabbalah from an academic approach. For some, this might, push you in one religious direction or another, or inspire, or provoke questions, or whatever it is. That is all wonderful, and I very much encourage you to take this further. But that is not my role. My role is simply to try and deal with the history of it. Having said that, mysticism, the subject under what we're approaching today, in fact presents a very unique problem for the historian. And it's important to notice that, which is that historians, of course, deal with what is, with the evidence that has been left over to us from the past, with texts, with objects, with all sorts of evidence that we have from previous centuries. Mysticism presents a unique problem precisely because, according to those who practice it, according to its own adherents and its own practitioners, mysticism or mystical schools seek specifically not to spread their word. They speak specifically not to leave behind too much of an indication of precisely what it is they believe, or their doctrines, or their modes of interpretation. And therefore, it is somewhat difficult for a historian or an academic to approach the subject, because often the response will simply be, well, obviously there is no evidence of X, or obviously there is little evidence of Y, because the people who are engaging in this didn't wish to leave behind any evidence, and therefore that is something that the historian must always bear in mind. Therefore, what we're going to be piecing together today, and generally in our discussions of this topic, have to have that caveat in mind all the time. And specifically, we're going to be discussing today a specific strain of Jewish mysticism, which arose in the medieval period, generally known as Kabbalah, which is not identical with Jewish mysticism as a whole. This is a much larger and richer subject that I have time to broach today, but it's very important to note that when one talks of Kabbalah, one talks of a quite discernible school, which has certain motifs and certain themes, such as the SS Sfirot and the theurgic capacity of human beings, which is not identical to all versions and all different types of Jewish mysticism, and it has differences from, let's say, Heichalot mysticism or Hasidei Ashkelon, which is 11th century phenomenon in medieval Central Europe, and therefore we're focusing on something very specific. And in general, we're focusing today at the rise of Kabbalah and reactions to the Kabbalah, and very specifically the form that it takes in the rise of reactions and negative reactions, specifically against the Zohar. Because the Zohar is an anthology or a corpus of texts which lies at the very heart, which eventually, as we'll see soon, gained ascendancy and lies at the very heart of a medieval, that specific strain of Kabbalah. And the difficulty really is that the Zohar came to the fore, it bubbled up to the surface between roughly the years 1280 and 1296, something like towards the end of the 13th century. And then the question becomes a bibliographic question. Who wrote the Zohar? Who put it together? Whose ideas does it represent? Because the traditional view, as is claimed by the Zohar or by those who immediately spread it and interpreted it, was that it faithfully recorded the views of a 2nd century sage, namely Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and his immediate disciples. Then it was put together by his immediate disciples, and therefore its doctrines, its halachot, its legal pronunciations, its various statements of fact are to be taken with the canonical weight that we afford to other parts of, let's say, early Tannaitic works or corpuses, such as the Mishnah, such as the halachic midrashim, etc., which of course within Judaism is a very heavy, very strong weight. However, there are those, as we'll see from the very inception of the Zohar, who see the Zohar not in that light. You see the Zohar not as faithfully sort of reflecting or faithfully recording the words of the ancient sages, but rather actually as a medieval work. Not only was it disseminated in the late 13th century, it was in fact written by people who lived in the late 13th century, and therefore obviously its weight, the sort of the strength of the Zohar in terms of how it influences Jewish texts and Jewish ideas is commensurately much less if it is a late medieval text, because in the medieval period we had an enormous amount of texts, philosophical, anti-philosophical, midrashic, and now mystical of various ways, and therefore the bibliographic question of what is the Zohar? Where does it come from? Who wrote it? What kind of book is it? What kind of authority, what kind of weight ought to have, is actually a question that until today really lies at the very center of those who, is an important question within the Jewish religion and development of Jewish religion in general, and also in those grappling with questions surrounding the Jewish religion and the weight that mysticism ought to play or not to play. This is a very important question. So what we're going to try and do over the next 45 minutes or so is chart the fantastic rise, the I would say quite quick and extraordinary rise in those who the dissemination and the authority given to the Zohar, and the various pre-modern counter reactions, or those who believe that actually the Zohar wasn't what its proponents and adherents said it was, and the circumstances of those two camps and the various claims and counterclaims, and we are going to go through that. So with that, I'm going to begin the lecture, and I'm going to share my screen with my slideshows, with the slideshow that I have here. I generally like teaching with a slideshow. I find it it helps certainly me concentrate, and also I think it would help everyone else at the same time. Okay, Kabbalah and anti-Kabbalah. So what we're going to do over the next few minutes is have a very, very brief overview of the rise of Kabbalah, and specifically the Kabbalah surrounding the Zohar, from the medieval period to the early modern, to the cusp of modernity itself. And next lecture, we're going to look at the Kabbalah during the era of the Enlightenment and the and onset of modernity itself. But initially, these are very briefly the steps that ought to be understood. First is that the very various preludes to the onset of what we now call today Kabbalah, which, as I say again, is a very specific mystical strain of Jewish mysticism. And preludes, there are points in the Tanakh, for example, Ezekiel chapters 1 and chapter 6, the Talmudic period, the famous story of the four who entered the orchard, the Pardes, and other such things. There is the Hechalot literature, which is a group of texts written roughly in the Talmudic period, though we're a little bit unsure when they were written, describing various sages ascending to the heavenly Hechalot, the palaces, and seeing all the the fabulous visions that they had. And the Hasidic Ashkenaz, which I already invoked, of the 12th century in Germany, 11th, 12th century. And the first stirrings, what we can actually see as recognizably Kabbalah, comes from Provence in roughly the 12th century. Names that we are familiar with are the Ra'avad, who's the same Ra'avad as the one who wrote the Hasagot, the glosses on the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, and his son Yitzchak Sagi Nahar, Yitzchak the Blind. And also around then was written likely also a certain book called the Sefer HaBahir, which can really claim to be the first absolutely unequivocally Kabbalistic text, and the first one that also sets out in quite a bit of detail the central motif of medieval Kabbalah, which is the 10-stage hypostatic emanation of God to the stages between the Godhead, the sort of divinely abstract and transcendent Godhead, and the physical world itself. They claim there are 10 interlocking, interwoven, interrelating, and interreacting stages called the Sephirot, the sort of these spheres of emanation. And that again was something that is really outlined for the very first time properly and fully in the Bahir. Which comes from roughly 12th century and likely Provence as well. The main centers of Kabbalah in 13th century go over to Spain. Again, this is a very, very brief overview. I'm not remotely trying to do justice. I'm just trying to set the historical stage. There are theories propounded by Moshe Idel and others, Menachem Kellner, that much of 13th century Spanish Kabbalah is a counter-reaction to Maimonidean rationalism over here. And there are a few different types, a few different schools or strains of Kabbalah that we see during the 13th century. One is in the Catalonian area, which is the mystical circles surrounding the great figure Ramban or Nachmanides, who himself travels to Eretz Yisrael at a certain point, but leaves behind 3 generations of students, of disciples who continue propounding his ideas. Again, because we have relatively few texts from this circle, it's difficult to know exactly a full worldview that they had. There is, of course, Castilla, the second mystical school, which slightly elsewhere in Spain. However, the one core text that it produced, namely the Zoharic anthology, which is essentially an anthology of exegesis and homiletics, and was originally written and circulated in fragments. And this is something very important. Until the advent of printing, the Zohar wasn't really a book per se. It was a series of fragments or pamphlets of booklets, you might be said, of mystical exegesis of the Tanakh, which imagines a chavura, a sort of circle of mystics, again from the 2nd century in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his various and those who surrounded him, and this was circulated again. And this became, as we'll see over the following few centuries, this eventually became the centerpiece of Jewish mysticism. However, during this time, this was, or I'll put it this way, scholars today think that the Zohar reflects a similar chabura of mystics that existed in Castilla during the 13th century, and their mystical output is reflected, or that constituted eventually the Zoharic text that we have today. And there is also the prophetic or linguistic school, which is the school of Abraham Abulafia. Once again, I don't have time to go into that, but it's important to note that you have these 3, I would say, major strains of Kabbalah going on at the time, and it's not clear at all that one of them would be any more popular or would be any more widespread than any of the others. It so happens, of course, that the second school, the Castilian school, the Zoharic school, would eventually come to dominate, as we shall later see. So for a few centuries, the Zohar continues to circulate, mainly in Spain, also a little bit overseas, but among fairly small groups of Kabbalists. Again, this is prior to printing. This is prior to the expulsion from Spain, as we'll see. And therefore, the Zohar was only known to relatively small circles of scholars. And therefore, we don't have the kind of polemics pro-Zohar and anti-Zohar that we're going to see later. In general, there are, we only have fragments of writings of approving and non-approving of the Zohar, and we're going to see that very soon. However, post 1492, that was the major date in which everything changed, because obviously this was the date of the Girush Sfarad, the expulsion of many tens of thousands of Jews from Spain, and that was the point in which Spanish scholars and scholarly circles and mystical circles, were obviously expelled. Some of them went to Italy, some of them went to various parts of the Ottoman Empire, some of them went eventually to Eastern Europe, some of them went to Eretz Israel, and that was really the time that their doctrines and their ideas spread all over the world. This was greatly aided, of course, by printing. Printing was an extraordinary technology for two reasons. Firstly, obviously, the Zohar and Zoharic texts could be much more quickly disseminated, be much more quickly spread throughout the entire world, and this is very important, and more cheaply and more efficiently as well. But more importantly, actually, when the Zohar was printed, we now finally have a final version of the entire Zoharic corpus, or at least a fixed version, a canonical version. Until this point, the Zohar, as I said, not only was circulated in manuscript, it was also considered what scholars today call a live text. And what we mean by a live text is a text that various scholars, wherever they are found, added and subtracted parts of the Zohar. And that's why pre-printing manuscripts of the Zohar that we have are substantially different one from another. If you ask, people who worked on this, Daniel Matt or Daniel Abrams or others, they'll tell you, yeah, we have lots of different forms of the Zohar, versions of the Zohar, because people would take the liberty of adding or subtracting parts of the Zohar during the centuries prior to printing. And therefore that leads to difficulty to know what exactly is part of the Zohar corpus, what isn't. Printing, I wouldn't say solves this problem, but it goes a long way towards standardizing the text. And it's the same with the biblical text, and of course, that takes us too far afield, but this is an important part to know. And another thing that I should mention, post-1942, there is a famous claim by Gershom Scholem in the 20th century that the Zoharic worldview, including its theodicy, its explanation of what the significance of catastrophe and catastrophic events, that according to him, was more satisfactory than philosophical rationalism or any other Jewish worldview, and that was why it was adopted by exiles from Spain. In other words, according to Shalom, it was the catastrophe, the violent ending of the golden, or rather the Spanish Jewish center, that brought about an adoption of the Zohar, not just because the scholars were spread out, not just because of printing, all these helped, but also because it was more ideologically helpful to conceive of catastrophic events through a Zoharic and Kabbalistic lens than it was through other lenses, and that's why it caught on like wildfire. This is hotly disputed by Moshe Idel and others, but this is a very important theory that is worth knowing. It was helped in the 15th and 16th century by the rise of Christian Hebraism. Again, this is a wave, a small wave, but nonetheless a discernible wave of Christian scholars, mainly in Italy and in Central Europe, who suddenly became very interested in Hebraism, Hebraic culture and Hebraic texts. And central to this was the Kabbalah, the famous Italian Renaissance humanist Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and others suddenly became enormously interested in Kabbalistic texts, and therefore it gained a measure of intellectual respectability. And of course, part of the 16th century rise of Kabbalah was the activity in Tzfat. Tzfat, the city of the land of Israel, became a textile and economic powerhouse very quickly, almost overnight, and attracted several scholars, and including mystics. And there was an enormous hive of activity, and those who may be familiar with the history there. But two major things happened in Tzfat during that time with regard to the Zohar and the Kabbalistic thought in general. One of them is that it became systematized. You had figures like Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, who decided to try and make a discernible, fairly logical system out of the rather haphazard texts of the Zohar and make it into a doctrine that was, that could be understood and analyzed and applied. And also because of the activities of Isaac Luria or Yitzhak Luria, the Ari, there came along a drastic expansion of the Zoharic Kabbalah and many other facets to that particular ideology, making it a much larger, much richer and deeper worldview in many ways, which has continued to assert influence throughout the Jewish world today, as we'll get to a little bit later. And this, of course, a very important point in the 16th century. 16th century also saw Kabbalistic practices seeping into halachic considerations. Now, I'm not going to go through this entirely, and I'm sure other speakers of the Kabbalah have talked about the interaction between Kabbalah and halakha, but this is important to know that about the 16th century, Rabbi Yosef Karo and others, this became a point in which the Kabbalistic ideas or practices started seeping into halachic texts and halachic norms. Again, a partial acceptance, a partial rejection. This is very complex and quite quite fine distinctions that must be drawn here. But just if you give an example, if you open up Maimonides' account of what one should do when you wake up in the morning, so according to Maimonides, you wake up in the morning and you immediately start saying brachot. You immediately start saying blessings. You open your eyes, you say one blessing, you stand up, you say another blessing. You can immediately start blessing. Whereas the Shulchan Aruch, the work by Rabbi Yosef Karo, again 16th century Tzfat, says that you first have to wash your hands because you have this impure spirit resting on your hands while you sleep. Again, an idea flowing from Kabbalistic text that made its way into the halachic corpus. And finally, with this very brief overview, that of course the works of Yitzhak Luria and the expansion of the Zohar in various specific directions led to or formed the basis, constituted the basis of an ideology that was taken by Shabtai Tzvi and his major theologian Nathan of Gaza, and became sort of a messianic cult in and of its own, or messianic movement in and of its own regard. And that certainly led to a counter reaction, as we shall see with Yaakov Emden and others, and the suspicion of certain forms of Kabbalah. But this, on one very brief slide, you can see the authorship of the Zohar in the late 13th century, its very slow progress throughout the 14th, 15th centuries, and suddenly in the late 15th and 16th century and onwards, you have this very rapid, very quick spreading of the Zohar, both in terms of the spreading of its doctrines and also its acceptance on the part of many scholars throughout the Jewish world, and therefore became a force to be reckoned with within Jewish life and Jewish practice and Jewish ideas. So let's take a look for the next for a little bit about skepticism, or at least counter reactions that we can discern by significant and important figures throughout the Jewish world. So the very earliest centuries, we can see Kabbalah was not so widespread, and therefore, as I mentioned, criticism of the Kabbalah was similarly limited in scope. However, we do have some fragments. I'm going to show you a very interesting piece in the Shutim of the Rivash, Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Sheshet Perfet, who was 14th century, and he says the following, one of his Shutim, one of his halachic works, where he says the following. He mentions the Kabbalists and mentions some of their practices, and he's not sure about this, and he says, also in the prayer of the 18 benedictions, the Shemona Esrei, the Kabbalists have a specific sphira towards which they direct their intentions for each and every blessing. All this is exceedingly bizarre in my eyes, zar ma'od be'enai, as one who's not a Kabbalist like them. There are also those who believe this to be a polytheistic doctrine. And I have already heard one of the philosophically inclined, Hamitpal Safim, denigrate the Kabbalists, saying that the idolaters believe in, the Christians, they believe in 3 gods, whereas the Kabbalists believe in 10 gods. Now, this is a very famous line and an accusation that's thrown in the Kabbalists. In other words, they're saying that, okay, the Christians against whom we fight a theological battle every day, they took the one God and split him into 3, and you, Kabbalists, very nice, you've taken the one God and split him into 10 sphirot, or 10 aspects or attributes or emanations of God himself. Now, this is, again, the Rivash is not saying this outright. He is quoting, I would say semi-approvingly, but he's certainly quoting one of, someone who is philosophically inclined. And he doesn't then say, oh, this is nonsense, or this is, this is not to be, this is not to be taken seriously. Rather, he goes and he has to find a Kabbalist who explains to him why this is not exactly the case and what exactly the Sfirot are, etc., etc. But we can see here at least evidence of philosophically inclined people in the early 1400s, the early 15th century, who see Kabbalah as theologically problematic. Okay. Now, there are other very important historical testaments that we have towards the problematic nature of the Kabbalah, and specifically the Zohar. And I'm talking now about the Sefer Yuchasin. The Sefer Yuchasin is a collection of histories and genealogies. It was written roughly year 1504 by a man called Avram Zakuto. It was only printed much later. However, the first edition prints the testimony of a man called Yitzchak Demin Akko, or Isaac of Akka, who affirms that there were many different opinions in Spain at the time, the late 13th century. So this is after pamphlets of the Kabbalah of the Zohar have started to be disseminated, have started to be considered by various Spanish scholars, and some were divided. Some said, oh, wow, this is amazing. This is the true record of the sayings and doings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his school. Whereas others would say, no, that this is actually something written and spread by a man called Moshe de Leon, but actually it is just his own work. And therefore, he traveled actually to Avila, which is the place that Moshe de Leon lived, and tried to buy off him the manuscript from which he claimed to have copied the Zohar. In other words, Moshe de Leon said, yes, I'm writing fragments of this Zoharic Kabbalistic text. However, I'm copying it from a manuscript that has been copied, that has its origin in 2nd century in the life of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So he travels to Avila. However, Moshe de Leon by that time had died. And Moshe de Leon's widow assures Yitzchak Zemin Akko, that there is in fact no ancient manuscript, and that her husband told her that he wrote it of his own accord, for financial gain, and that was that's really what the Zohar was, just Moshe de Leon's own general ideas and own mystical imaginings, but it wasn't actually truly copied from an ancient manuscript. And this evidence is there. Now, this evidence is sitting in the Sefer Yuchasin from the 1500s. How reliable is it? I mean, again, it is a copy of a diary entry of a man, Yitzchak Zemin Akko, who lives in the early 1300s. It is, his own testimony of his travels, and it's the testimony of Moshe de Leon's wife and daughter, both of them, who said that their husband had told them that there was no ancient manuscript. Is this very good historical evidence? The answer is this is obviously a question that's fiercely debated among historians. Some say, yes, this is, you see here in black and white, Moshe de Leon's own admission, or his wife's own admission, that actually, no, there was no manuscript. He was just writing things off of his own head. Whereas, of course, others would say, no, that this is a very unreliable train of historical transmission, and therefore this evidence is not to be taken into consideration. But nonetheless, the reason I bring it here is you at least have some indication in the 1300s, there are at least one person, i.e. Yitzchak Zemin Akko, who expressed the skepticism, or at least recorded skepticism about the origins of the Zohar and about its antiquity and authority, that has been expressed, and that was that existed during the 1300s already in the very early stages of the Zoharic transmission and study. Okay, now let's take a look. Now, over the next few centuries, before the rise of the Enlightenment and general skepticism of the Zohar, there are three, and only three, scholars who wrote treatises that we know of, that excellent treatises, that call into question specific or specifically undermine the antiquity or the authority of the Zohar and its Kabbalistic teachings. Some do it partially, some do it sort of entirely, and we're going to look at each one of them in turn, because each one of them are very important, and each one adds another layer of, I would say, this rabbinic anti-Kabbalistic understanding, which I would argue forms its own specific school of thought. Again, all this being in the pre-modern era. So the very first that we're going to look at is a man called Eliyahu del Medigo. I don't know why I've written Megiddo up here, but it is Elijah del Medigo, and he was a Jewish Aristotelian thinker. So he was a late philosopher. Again, his dates, he died in 1493. This is right at the end of the 15th century. And he was a follower of Maimonides and Averroes. And he, in fact, was close and was a sort of a chavruta and even a tutor to several of these Italian Hebraist intellectuals, including Mirandola, including Johannes Reuchlin and others. And he wrote, so towards the end of his life, he saw the spread of Kabbalah. He saw how it was slowly gaining credence throughout Italy. And he decided, and other places, and he decided he was going to write a philosophical treatise, firstly, justifying a sort of philosophically oriented and sophisticated Judaism, and secondly, attacking those forces that he believed to be undermining the possibility of having a philosophically sophisticated Judaism, principal among those, the Kabbalists and their central document, the Sefer HaZohar. So he wrote a treatise called Bechinat Hadat. It was written in Crete in 1490. And he wrote that he believed that Kabbalah ran contrary both to philosophical Judaism, but also to mainstream Talmudic Judaism. Again, don't forget that Kabbalah, and specifically the Zoharic Kabbalah, is a very bold system of ideas and system of exegesis. It really, it makes very extraordinary claims about God, extraordinary claims about how the world works, about how creation happens, about the function of mitzvot, etc. Again, this is not the time to flesh out those doctrines, but it's important to note that they constitute a very, let's say, different worldview from both, well, not different, but a very extensive worldview that stands to a certain degree apart from both Talmudic and philosophically inclined Judaism. So what did he claim against the authenticity of the Zohar? Well, firstly, he noted, and he was, again, at the very earliest, that the Zohar was absent from rabbinic or medieval texts. In other words, if Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai generally wrote or was responsible for a important mystical tract, an esoteric tract called the Zohar, one would expect to find some reference somewhere in the Talmud, in the Midrashim, in Rashi or Ramban or Rambam or any of the Gaonim or any of the earlier thinkers, and there's not one word mentioned about it ever at any point. There's a complete absence. Now, again, Is it legitimate to draw historical conclusions from absence of evidence? That's a difficult question. And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. But he points out that this astonishing absence of the Zohar, medieval, and rabbinic texts is an indication against its antiquity. Okay, there are anachronisms in the Zohar. Anachronisms means it means that there are points in the Zohar which belong actually to a different age, right? So, for example, the Zohar quotes frequently Amoraim, right? Those who live in the Talmudic, the 3rd and 4th century and 5th century Babylonia, which would have been very difficult to do had it been written in 2nd century Eretz Israel by Rishon Bar Yochai and his students. In other words, it's quoting rabbis who lived theoretically many centuries later. The main thing that Del Medigo was very upset about is that he believed, again, and this you can see this in Rambam and many other Jewish philosophers of the day, that he believed that the Aristotelian system of science and metaphysics and philosophy, he believed this to be something like a settled science. He believed this to accurately describe the way the world worked physically and metaphysically, and therefore he believed that any system that attacked an Aristotelian form of Judaism was, again, just philosophically and scientifically unsound. It was something that was leading him backwards, away from the truth and towards a discredited Neoplatonic understanding of the world. Again, I wish this was a 5 or 10 part series. I could really go into detail. Is not the place to go into Neoplatonism right now, but it's important to note that in general, Jewish philosophy of the medieval period relied principally on neo-Aristotelian views as reflected and refracted by Muslim and Christian thinkers, whereas mystical ideas, specifically Kabbalah and many other mystical and Sufi Islam and other strains, principally saw Neoplatonism as developed in the early centuries of the Common Era as the main philosophical model that they were working off. Again, I don't have time to get into it, but basically he saw this as a step in the wrong direction, scientifically, ideologically, and philosophically. He also saw as heretical, and this is actually important, heretical the notion of the theurgic power of human activity. With theurgic power, I mean that the human beings have the possibility of completing an action here on this earth and having a discernible effect in the heavens, right? Kabbalists believe that if a human being does a good deed here on earth, so then it affects a tikkun, a kind of rectification of the sphirot of the sort of the worlds of the upper realms, which include the 10 sphirot, and it actually brings them closer together and heals them. So human beings are, in effect, so to speak, helping God by healing the supernal realms of the sphere, and that's why many communities before doing various mitzvot, before performing something or praying, they'll say something like l'shem yichud kudsha bricho ushchinte, that I'm doing this. Why? Because I'm trying to affect this theurgic activity of uniting God and His Shekhinah. In other words, uniting different elements of the spherotic ecosystem or ecology with each other, bringing harmony where there is in fact disharmony in the upper realms. And for an Aristotelian and a strict philosopher like Del Medigo, this was heretical. What do you mean? Human beings can help God? Human beings can bring perfection to an already perfected realm? This is nonsense. He didn't. All of this, in his eyes, was complete heresy, and this formed the basis of philosophical opposition to the Zohar and the Kabbalah. Unfortunately, this book was published only in 1629 and did not really achieve a widespread impact, and therefore it had to wait till the next two scholars in order to really have a sort of serious tradition of Kabbalah skepticism, which we're going to go on to now. So who are the next two? So the next one is, already in the early modern period, Leon de Modena. Hang on, let me get myself out of his face. So Leon de Modena, or Yehuda Ari of Modena, was really one of the most extraordinary rabbinic figures of the early modern period. He was the rabbi, or one of the major rabbis in the Italian ghetto in Venice. That's where he lived most of his life. And he was an extraordinary, I would call it a Renaissance man. In other words, he was a man of business and an intellectual, and did all sorts of things, and an author and a publisher and a sort of financier, and just one of these people who dabbled in all sorts of endeavors to varying levels of success. In other words, some of his endeavors really weren't particularly successful at all. But one of the things impressively that he was the rabbi and preacher of the Venice ghetto. And in fact, apparently he was so successful that his drashot, his sermons, were so well received that various members of the Christian intelligentsia, including priests, used to come into the ghetto in order to hear him speak. That he was considered a religious preacher of brilliant capability, and this was appreciated beyond the bounds of the Jewish community. He witnessed the rise of Kabbalah, and specifically Zohar Kabbalah, both in Jewish circles and, as I mentioned before, in Christian circles. The problem was a few problems. Firstly, he, as Baal Halacha, as a halachist, was very concerned about the encroachment of Kabbalah on Halacha. He saw this as the the usurpation of the authority of the halacha from a sort of alien body of text. He also was concerned about the anti-Maimonidean sort of ideas and activities of the Kabbalists, and most of all, or perhaps not most of all, but certainly very importantly, was his skepticism or his active opposition towards the use of Kabbalah by Christian missionaries in order to tempt Jews away from Judaism and to the baptismal font. And again, this was in fact the case. Many Christian Hebraists, or in fact, I would say pretty much all of them, they weren't of pure intention. This wasn't a movement which sought to understand Hebraism or sought to gain knowledge for knowledge's sake. Rather, they sought to validate Christianity through Jewish texts, and specifically through Kabbalistic texts. They saw Kabbalah, and specifically the Zohar, as providing absolute validation for the mission and the rise of Christ and the Trinity of the Godhead, etc. And therefore, this and many Jews actually became heretics or became apostates due to this, and came back and tried to convince other fellow Jews into the similar apostasy and conversion towards Christianity based on their readings of the Kabbalah. And therefore, he saw Kabbalah and the authority given to the Kabbalah as dangerous for his surrounding Jewish community. And therefore, he wrote a book, one of many, many books that he wrote, called the Ari Nohem. It's a very good book by a Princeton professor called Yaakov Dweck on the Ari Nohem and the surrounding and the Kabbalah, or rather the intellectual ferment surrounding that and Modena's life. It's well worth reading Yaakov Dweck's book. And anyway, so he makes a series of claims here, and this was a far more thorough and in fact book-length series of objections to the Zohar, and went much further than Medigo went in his previous works. So firstly, he expanded on the anachronisms pointed out by Del Medigo and by Azaria Dorossi, another important Italian intellectual. And this includes references in the Zohar to medieval prayers, such as Nishmat Kol Chai and other medieval prayers, and also to specific world events. For example, the Zohar describes quite vividly, although it doesn't call it by name, the rise of the Ishmaelite kingdom, i.e. the rise of Islam, and the spread of Islam, and the sort of conquest of Islam over the entire Middle East. Again, that happened in the 7th century. How can it be that a 2nd century text would talk about an event that happened 5 centuries later? I doubled that line. He also pointed out several halachic contradictions between the Zohar and the Talmud. This is something that people, or that's not generally so well known, which is that the Zohar is actually to quite a bit of a degree a text which includes halachic decisions or halachic proclamations which are put in the mouths of these various Tanaim. And the problem is that some of these halachic positions are in fact in contradiction to the Talmud. I mean, one very famous and quite controversial statement by the Zohar is that anyone who puts on tefillin on Chol HaMoed is chayav mita, is liable to be put to death. Now, I wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. I'm part of an Ashkenazi Jewish community, and there are many others who do so, and there is a perfectly halachically legitimate statement according to the exoteric, the non-mystical halachic tradition that we have. However, according to the Zohar, that is absolutely horrendous and beyond the bounds of any of acceptability. And again, the contradictions between the halacha as we have it in the exoteric, the non-mystical texts, and the Zohar, that seems to be a serious point against taking the Zohar as an authoritative text. The language of the Zohar, and the Zohar is written in an Aramaic, which again, during the 2nd century, during the time of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Aramaic was the language of everyday commoners, of the language that everyone spoke, and therefore it wouldn't have made so much sense to write a mystical tract in that language, because everyone spoke it, everyone knew it. In fact, it was halachic and biblical Hebrew that was considered the language or the plaything of scholars, of great rabbinic scholars, and therefore all rabbinic texts at the time are written in Hebrew. However, in the 13th century, by the time Moshe de Leon and the Kabbalists of Castile in the 13th century come along, Aramaic is quite an unusual language, a language really of Talmudic scholars, and therefore it makes perfect sense in the 13th century to write an esoteric tract that is to be hidden from the eyes of the ordinary people in a language they didn't really understand, i.e. the language of Aramaic. But also, it's quite a late Aramaic, a post-Talmudic Aramaic as well. We won't go into that for the time being. Modena was also bothered by the self-glorification of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. There are some very extraordinary statements in the Zohar, which again, don't really have time to go into, but that seem to portray Rishon Bar Yochai as, and again, I hate to say it, a kind of demi-god, a sort of semi-divine figure, or at the very least semi-divine, in the Zohar. And again, this seems to be very odd, especially if Rishon Bar Yochai substantively wrote the Zohar, to have self-glorification and even self-quasi-deification of Rishon Bar Yochai in that text seems, again, in the eyes of Modena, to be a point against it. I must interject here that all of these points have been disputed by those who have written books to defend Kabbalah. And we're going to see a few of them in a moment. But it's important to know that these are the objections, and of course there are ways possibly to try and answer these objections. But these are the objections that are brought. However, what's interesting is that Ari Nohem, meaning De Modena, was very much entranced and captivated by the beauty and the creativity of the Zohar. In other words, he's saying, listen, what we have here is a medieval midrash that has problematic theology and that has various anachronisms, etc., and halachic inaccuracies. However, he says this is a very beautiful midrashic text. It's a text that is, stands at the very peak of the very pinnacle of Jewish creativity from the medieval period. And interestingly, I mean, this is just sort of by the by, but this is a very sharp distinction, even nowadays, among Kabbalah skeptics. In other words, there's some people who say, listen, the Zohar is not from Rishon Bar Yochai, it's a medieval text. However, look how brilliant it is, look how beautiful it is, look how extraordinary the text is. If it is written in the medieval period, it is certainly a crowning victory, crowning glory of the medieval period. Whereas there are those other Kabbalah skeptics or anti-Kabbalistic thinkers and writers who say something like, it's from the 13th period, and also it has lots of problematic parts to it, which, we don't even think it's a good text. It shouldn't exist in the Jewish canon, not only because of its late dating, but also because it's just, it doesn't stand up to what we think are the standards, either the aesthetic standards or the moral standards or the theological standards or the halachic standards of what we would call a text within the Jewish canon. And the several authors, so the Ari Nohem was actually circulated, was printed, and was quite well known among Europe and seen as a very serious challenge to the Kabbalah, and various others responded to it, including the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, in 18th century Italy, wrote his own little dialogue called Choker Umekubal, again, a dialogue between a researcher, so to speak, and a Mekubal, directly in order to answer these these challenges, these points set out by Leon de Modena. Whether he was successful or not, again, is subject for another time. Whether he provided satisfying counter objections is something we can perhaps discuss another point. But again, this was finally the first book-length, seriously taken point of serious Kabbalah and Zohar skepticism voiced in the Jewish world that we have today. And finally, the third and final and greatest and most extensive of the pre-modern skeptics of the Kabbalah or certain elements specifically of the Zohar Kabbalah was my own ancestor, Yaakov Emden, a great rabbi from the 18th century Germany. So he was a well-known, a leading rabbinic figure, a brilliant halachist and a prolific author, also a leading polemicist. He would write on anything and everything. He was a very considerable heresy hunter in post-Sabbatean Europe. He had this famous controversy with Yonasan Eibeshitz and other senior, other rabbinic figures and other senior members of the Jewish world. Interestingly, part of Rabbi Emden's prolific nature came from the fact that he actually had, this is one of my favorite facts about him, he had a printing press in his own house. So he might have been the sort of precursor of all modern bloggers, right? Nowadays, any idiot with an internet connection can just put their opinion out there and just have it circulate. Rabbi Emden, of course, not an idiot, a great man, but nonetheless, he had an idea, had an opinion, wrote it up, printed it in his own house, and disseminated it across Europe, and that's why his books are, one of the reasons why they received such a large audience. Now, what's interesting about Yaakov Emden was that he himself was a Kabbalist, quite an enthusiastic Kabbalist. There's an excellent article recently brought out in the Harvard Theological Review by a brilliant young, a scholar called Tamara Morsel-Eisenberg, a professor, I think, of Jewish Studies at NYU, on Yaakov Emden as both a Kabbalist and an anti-Kabbalist. He was a very complicated figure because on the one hand, many of his works reflected the fact that he relied on Kabbalistic themes, thought Kabbalah was this ancient, esoteric, important doctrine right to the heart of Judaism, on the one hand. But on the other hand, he clearly saw the danger of Kabbalah because he was one of the prime heresy hunters of the Sabbateans and the post-Sabbatean Europe, who again relied on Kabbalah. So on the one hand, he needed it. On the other hand, he recognized this tremendous danger and possibility for misuse among Jews in Europe. And that was that led him to write the Mipachat Sfarim, a book that he wrote in Alton in 1768, which was, until that point, the most extensive and the most wide-ranging work of Kabbalah skepticism until that point, until we'll get to next week. So it was a very interesting point, because as I said, he himself was a Kabbalist and therefore couldn't completely get rid of the Zohar. He couldn't shift it entirely from his bookshelf. So therefore, what he did was he advocated that actually there is a core text of the Zohar, a sort of an ancient, pure, mystical, and unsullied core, which is legitimate and does reflect the Kabbalah of the ancient period and Rosh Bar Yochai. However, according to him, large portions of the Zohar contain very obvious indications of having been written at later dates, some during the Gaonic period, some during sort of the early medieval period, some by Moshe de Leon himself, and it's quite a complex view that he advocates there. But essentially, he brought in several other considerations which previous writers, which de Modena and Mendigo had not brought in yet. One was he noticed the influence of Iberian Spanish and other Romance languages in the Zohar, and specific word plays, and the most famous of which, the famous pun in the Zohar, which it calls a synagogue, which it calls a Bet Knesset, calls a Bet Tfilah, an Esh Noga, right, a burning flame. And this has been pointed out by many that Esh Noga in medieval Spanish, in the Spanish that of Moshe de Leon lived, Esh Noga was Es Noga, which is Spanish for a synagogue. In other words, it's making a pun in medieval Spanish about the nature of a synagogue, which of course is a very clear indication of at least that passage in the Zohar being of much later vintage. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who was of course extremely knowledgeable in the entire Jewish canon, certainly in medieval philosophy, he noted that parts of the Zohar adopted medieval philosophy, specifically from Shmuel HaNagid and from Yehuda HaLevi and other sort of non-rationalists, or not specifically rationalist Jewish philosophers, and their elements, sometimes really almost copied and pasted, appear in the Zohar itself. He noticed also that it's a very odd document because it keeps making various claims about Eretz Yisrael, but it seems that those who wrote the Zohar never went to Eretz Yisrael, because it kept on positing various topographical, geographical facts that seem to just be untrue. How far one thing is from another, what is next to each other, what a certain place looks like, and it just seems that, again, this is a mystical text, an esoteric text. Who knows what is really being said? But if you read it in its plain language, it seems to make all sorts of errors about Eretz Yisrael. And again, which is fully understandable if it was written by one person or by a group of mystics who didn't actually live in Eretz Yisrael. It'd be very weird if those who lived in Eretz Yisrael made errors of that point. He also didn't like the Zohar's exegesis. Now, this is the big difference between Yaakov Emden and Leon de Modena, which is that Modena was very charmed by the Zohar. He liked it. He thought it was brilliant. He thought the exegesis was beautiful and very poetic and very admirable. Yaakov Emden remained entirely uncharmed by the Zohar. He really thought that there were many exaggerated or implausible readings of biblical verses. And finally, and this is perhaps one of the most important points that's picked up by Shadar and other later skeptics of the Kabbalah, is that Yaakov Emden noted that the Zohar relies on biblical vocalizations. I mean, Nukudot and Ta'amim. What I mean is the vowels of the Bible and the cantillation marks, the way one reads it in the synagogue, and these are stated out loud, stated specifically in the Zohar. It states the names of the vowels, states the names or the way in which appears certain cantillation marks. And what's fascinating is that according to rabbinic tradition, these cantillation marks and these vowels, etc., go back to Sinai, or some say it was instituted by Ezra, etc. However, by the 16th century, you had a grammarian called Elijah Levita, or Eliyahu HaBachor, a leading sort of 16th century an important grammarian who lived in Italy, who wrote a book called Mesorat HaMasoret, who in his third introduction more or less proved quite convincingly that these vowels, which were never mentioned in the rabbinic literature, you'll never find a Gemara which says, oh, here is a komatz, here's a patach, here's whatever. In fact, the Gemara and other Midrashim frequently dispute how to read the biblical text, which doesn't make sense if you have vowels in front of you. But no, do you read it like this or do you read it like that? That is very frequent, very common in the Talmud, and that's because again, this is the idea of Elijah Levita, and this is generally the consensus of modern academics as well, is that the specific systems of vowels and cantillations only came post-Talmudically, probably in Tiberia by what's called the Anshe Tiberia, or the Masoretes of Tiberias, between about the 6th and the 9th century. And Yaakov Emden says, look, you have the Zohar, which mentions the vowels and mentions the cantillation marks, and this is unlike any other piece of rabbinic literature we have, because they didn't have those during the time of the Talmud, the time of the Mishnah, and therefore this also points to a later dating of the Zohar. Now, this is a very important historical document, Mitpachat Sfarim, because this is the very first time that a universally recognized rabbinic heavyweight gives strong backing to Zohar skepticism. Okay, and this is an important stage because this gives it genuine a stamp of rabbinic approval in a way, and also makes it at least an intellectually a respectable position to say that large parts of the Zohar, at the very least, are later interpolations and if you want to call them forgeries. Now this can be seen. Now many later senior rabbinic figures were not willing to say out loud, not willing to state very bluntly what Emden had stated. However, they were willing to reference him. I'll give you an example here from the Shut Chatam Sofer. And of course, the Chatam Sofer was very important, one of the most important early modern rabbis, late 18th century. And he wrote the following in one of his Shutim. And I'm not going to give the background and context where we're running out of time. I want to take some questions. But he speaks, he's talking about someone who doesn't trust the Zohar. We find in your area, he says to his interlocutor, Sefer Mitpachat Sfarim, the work of Mitpachat Sfarim, Lemoreno Harav Yaivetz. That was the Yaakov Emden, Yaakov Ben Tzvi. Timtza Sham, you'll find that there. Ki davar gadol. Hang on. Sorry, I lost it. So yeah, Ki davar gadol, davar hanavi zal be'inyan zeh. You'll find something extraordinary, something that is Dvar Navi, that is almost prophetic utterance there. This is something that will astonish all those who read it. And that should suffice for those who know what I'm talking about. In other words, Chatam Sofer very obliquely and very delicately refers to the Mitpachat Sfarim and refers to what the Yavitz, what Yaakov Emden wrote. And again, seems to give his tacit approval, but of course doesn't want to come out fully against the Zohar. It achieved a vaunted canonical status among many Jewish circles, therefore wasn't willing to write an all-out attack against it, but was willing to reference the fact that one of the great rabbis of the previous generation, Yaakov Emden, did. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop the screen and stop the share and stop the lecture, bring you all back in. We have 7 minutes officially on the clock, but I'm willing to stay later and answer questions, etc. This is, on one foot, the rise of the Zohar, its acceptance across much of the Jewish world, and also the rise of very important voices expressing skepticism against the claims of the Zohar, its authenticity, its antiquity, and its authority. Okay.
Wow, thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions, comments, they can unmute, raise their hand, type in the comments.
Is anyone?
Simon?
Yeah, I was intrigued by what you said about the Zohar's popularity being connected to the catastrophe of the expulsion from Spain.
Sure.
I was wondering if there's a parallel to that in our own times, if the reason why there seems to be a renaissance of interest in Kabbalah is in part a reaction to the Holocaust and other events of the 20th century.
Okay, so
I guess Sholem wrote about that as well. He was, of course, at that period.
So firstly, Gershom Sholem was very much Gershom, a very important 20th century Kabbalah scholar, was very much part of it. Firstly, let me state that you very accurately diagnosed an issue, or you put your finger on a phenomenon in the last half century in Jewish life, which is the extraordinary renaissance of the Kabbalah and specifically the Zohar. Right? If you go back to really until the time of the Second World War, even until the 50s, 60s, you'll find the Zohar and Kabbalah as something which is studied by a very small portion of people in cloistered circles in yeshivot, in hole-in-the-wall yeshivot in Jerusalem or wherever else. And nowadays, you find books on Kabbalah everywhere. You find it on every bookshelf, and you find it taught in yeshivot, and you find it being translated by major presses, and you find it being sold, and you find lectures on the subject. It's a tremendous phenomenon. Why exactly that is a little bit of, I mean, I'm sure there are many who can theorize. It really does track with a general rediscovery of sort of spiritual new agey ideas generally in the world. I think that is, that's definitely part of it. And within religion in general, and the sort of incursion of Eastern style meditational yoga-like religions into the West, that's definitely part of it, and certainly this is part of the story in North America. It's also part of the story that yes, maybe the more satisfying perhaps theodicy of the Zohar might play a part of it. It's also definitely part, I think, of the Zionist revival, and I think I remember Arthur Green mentioning this once in some lecture, which is that the part of the Zionist return to Israel, and the reflowering of Jewish culture, spearheaded by people like Achad Ha'am and Chaim Nachum Bialik and Gershom Shalom and people like that, was a rediscovery of the full gamut of Jewish texts, of reading of Midrashim and Agadot and reading now the Zohar and reading medieval Jewish poetry and things that had been neglected for centuries by the mainstream, suddenly became of great currency among the Jews and among Jewish states, and therefore that's certainly a phenomenon we see, and I think that's also part of it, but it's likely a confluence of many factors. Anyone else?
We have in the chat, it's a related question, I believe. Why do you think the Zohar was accepted to such an extent at that time in Jewish history? Sort of related.
I mean, it is related. As I said, okay, so yes, why is it accepted post-Spanish expulsion? So I'll very briefly recapitulate some of what I said, which is that it was, again, a variety of factors. One was simply the expulsion of the people. It was the Spanish scholars themselves suddenly found themselves in Jewish corners all over the world. There is the fact that soon afterwards, I mean, the advent of printing by the mid-16th century, that was also a very important part. There's Sholom's thesis, which is that the Kabbalah of the Zohar, and specifically the school of the Ari Yitzhak Luria, with its theology of Shever and Tikkun, this notion that actually from the very beginning, there was this catastrophe among the spherotic, among the supernal realms, the spherotic realms, and that is the duty of people to affect a rectification below, such that there'll be a rectification above, and basically bring the Messiah that way. And that, again, according to Shalom, that those two events are intimately linked. Maybe not. Some have doubted that. And also there's a possibility, and this is, I think one of Arthur Green's works is his introduction to the Zohar, by Stanford University Press, a very good introduction, in which he says that it's also possible that the new lands in which people found themselves, namely the Ottoman Empire, namely Eastern Europe, and other areas, were much more conducive to a mystical, non-rational form of religion, and that sort of tied more to the sort of the strains of religion that were going on elsewhere in the world. And also this importantly coincides with the decline of rationalist philosophy. In other words, the 15th, 16th century was the tail end, in fact, the very end, the complete decline of rationalist philosophy, both in Judaism and also to a certain degree in Islam and Christianity as well. And that those two things coincided. Now, to ask which is the chicken, which is the egg, did rationalist philosophy decline because of the rise of Kabbalah or vice versa, is not so easy to answer, but nonetheless, those two factors are intimately intertwined. Shmuley, how much is the extent of Kabbalah and Shulchan? I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that question, because that's a question for someone who knows the broad halach. That's a question for an expert in halachic texts. Okay, and I think that's fair. I would point to that. There are some good. There's a book I have on my shelf by Boaz Hus called The Zohar Reception and Impact. The Zohar, yes, Reception and Impact, in which he goes through a little bit of this. There is some writings I'm aware of on the subject. What I do know is that Yosef Karo did more than anyone else to bridge the general worlds of Halakha and Kabbalah, especially because Yosef Karo was also the author of a quite extraordinary mystical diary called Magid Mesharim, in which he claimed to be visited by a Magid, which is this sort of angelic tutor, I would suppose, at night, who used to tell him things and tell him secrets, who identified himself as he called himself Mishnah, the Mishnah, that's why it's called, anyway, Magid Mesharim, and therefore he greatly legitimized, to a certain degree, Kabbalah among halachic scholars, and in fact, so much so that the book that I spoke about last time, and I'll speak about next week as well, which is Shadal's great work of Kabbalah skepticism called Vikuach Chochmat Kabbalah, the last sticking point that they discuss is Yosef Karo, because it's very difficult it's not so difficult to discount Moshe de Leon for let's say a Jew who believes in the regular canonical text. It's not so difficult even to discount someone like Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, because Rabbi Yitzchak Luria didn't write any halachic texts and didn't write any great works of Jewish thought or whatever it is. However, it's very difficult to turn around and say Rabbi Yosef Karo was fundamentally deceived about the nature of the Kabbalah, and that is a sticking point among Kabbalah skeptics until this day, which proves very difficult to dislodge. Right, this is the final comment by SK over here. Yes, the one of the great issues of Kabbalah versus philosophy, again explored at length by Shadal, which I'll talk about a bit more next week, is which is more dangerous, or put it better, which takes Judaism too far afield in different directions, right? In other words, the philosophers will say, look, or let me put it this way: both philosophy and Kabbalah have their system relies upon saying the exoteric text, the Torah that we have, is merely a garb, or merely, it is an outer shell of an inner truth, and that inner truth is something esoteric which has been passed down the generations, and here I'm revealing it to you. For the philosophers, it is the truths of Aristotelian philosophy. That's what that's essentially the Moreh Nevuchim is. It's to explain the philosophical core at the heart of the biblical texts. Whereas for the Zohar and the Kabbalists, it is Kabbalah, is the secrets of the esoteric secrets of the Kabbalah and the Esesfirot, etc. And that is the core around which the exoteric texts are merely a garb. Now the question then becomes, okay, so if you're forced to choose which one pushes Judaism too far afield, right? Which one is the more legitimate reinterpretation of Jewish texts as they stand? And again, this will be differed upon by partisans of each of the two schools of thought. And of course, there's a middle school of thought, which sort of rejects both. Or at least minimizes both. People like, the Khatam Sofer and Shimshon Rafael Hirsch and people like that who would say, listen, Kabbalah is for the few skeptics, and maybe the Rambam could have his philosophy, but actually the main core of Judaism is just the halachic text. It is the plain text meaning of the Chumash, is the plain text meaning of the Gemara, and we shouldn't spend too much of our time and energy trying to imagine what might be hidden deep within the recesses of this particular ecosystem, be it Kabbalistic or philosophical. Any final points, questions?
Is there any other examples of philosophies or books or things that had such a widespread and managed to penetrate halakha as well? Meaning not just managed to capture the minds, but also have such an effect on halakha?
Difficult to point to a specific halachic book. What I would say is that the dogmatic statement specifically of Maimonides did. And this is, of course, the famous argument between the Rambam and the Ra'avad on the incorporeality of God. If you open the Mishnah Torah to Hilchot Yisodei HaTorah, you'll find Maimonides' famous statement: anyone who says that God has any physical component whatsoever is a heretic. He is considered outside the camp. He's holds heretical views. Whereas the Ra'avad, who comments there, says, actually, he basically expresses outrage and says, Rabim v'tovim mimenu, many greater than him have in fact held this. This is evidence that many, senior, let's say, scholars of the medieval period at least thought there was a possibility that God had some kind of corporeal existence. Having said that, Maimonides seems to have won on that one. And therefore, Maimonides' dogmatic assertions have made their way sort of into halachic text, which is that till nowadays you ask most halachic authorities, what do you do with a Jew who denies Torah min hashamayim or denies that God doesn't have a body? And they'll say apikoros. They'll say they belong outside the Orthodox camp. With regard to a specific book of philosophy, I can't think of any, but perhaps it might strike me in the middle of the night, and I'll give you a ring.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you so much, Hakam. Happy birthday. And stay tuned for next week when we'll have part 2. That's all, everyone.
Thank you.